Last time I left off mentioning the dialectic of light and shadow. So the dialectic of ego and the shadow being the negation of the ego, the negation of that representation of the self. As we remember, the representation being the small soul or Atman, and the self being the big soul or the will or Brahma. So the development of individuation, according to Jung, is the integration of the ego in the self. So the kind of development of an authenticity of the ego in authentically representing the self. Now, there's a kind of issue with this concept of authenticity that Professor Hans-Georg Möller pointed out in his book You and Your Profile. I have an interview with Möller on this channel, which you can check out. And I also have a video discussing his concept of identity. His critique of the concept of authenticity is a critique that there is a sort of fake, false idea incorporated in it, that there is some sort of immutable true self that one tries to kind of approach and adhere to. And that kind of stems and coincides with authenticity being a technology of identity that correlated with the kind of cultural paradigm of a form of individualism, especially dominating in the West. One could say the development of modernity is a development of authenticity, and the transition to postmodernity is the transition from authenticity to prophelicity, basing one's identity merely on second-order observation. Prophelicity seems to be very overt about the fact that there is no essential basis to its identity, and all it is made up of, all it consists of, is second-order observation, and thus no actual essential core to it, or one could say substantial core to it. Möller argues here with Hegel. He also brings in Hegel as a sort of description of identity being something that is a continuous process of reconciling coincidences, contradictions, within the notion of identity. So an identity is not some sort of necessary constant thing, but a constantly changing and reconciling of opposites. Now, the problem in that analysis is that it concludes that the temporal difference, the pure, let's say, becoming as opposition to a sense of constant being that doesn't change, that is a necessary condition to conclude that there is just no such thing as a true identity. However, it is possible to include temporality, not as a sort of like linear time, but the sense of a kind of being that is given from the future and is reached over via the present to the past. This sort of phenomenal encounter of time and temporality, and this sort of phenomenal encounter of one's own limitation and one's own being towards death, opens up the kind of temporal structure of the, let's say, authentic sense of self. And in this sense, I would use authenticity in a different meaning, in a different context as Möller uses it. Möller, one could characterize Möller's view as pertaining more towards a sort of cultural practice of individualism, whereas the sense of authenticity with Heidegger is more a sort of mode of approaching something that lies within the trajectory of this sort of unfoldment of the ego within the world, and the kind of reconciliation of the ego with its narrator, the self. this narrator was referred to by Nietzsche in Thus Spake Zarathustra as the kind of great sagacity, the big wisdom that lies at the foundation of even reason. That is, let's say, before even reason comes about. And so this sort of constant reconciliation between thesis, which is the ego, antithesis, which is the shadow, and the synthesis out of both is the development that Jung calls individuation. But this reconciliation does not work if the ego and the shadow become a polarity that seek to destroy each other. That would be a dissolution into nothingness, a dissolution into the void. So the void, instead of being fought as a polar opposite, this kind of negation of the ego being fought as in the shadow, which is often seen in forms of shadow projection or shadow possession. One could call shadow possession as this phenomenal structure of evil, of malignancy, and shadow projection of like identifying evil in someone else or in some other group. And instead of that, incorporating the shadow as in something that you recognize to be actually something that is part of yourself. So the recognition of that which is not your ego as something that is part of yourself grows that initial sphere of the ego, and thus establishes and expands more into the sphere, into the larger sphere of the big sagacity of the, let's say, big soul, namely the self. So Heidegger would even have a certain thing to say about this, in the sense that Dasein is always guilty to some extent, and it is guilty to this kind of unsurmountability of its own draft in the unfoldment of its being in the world. So it is not possible to turn all of its modes of being into mere contingencies, but it is driven on a sort of necessity that it encounters, especially when being thrown back to its own mortality, its own limitation. So there is this sense of authentic being oneself, which is not a sort of constant abstract mode. It is more something that is encountered when this particular moment of narration is felt, when this particular reconciliation between the narrator and the narration is kind of come to fruition. And prophelicity represents this kind of approaching of the void, this approaching of the collective shadow, and that is this externalization of the unconscious that we've seen now through technology, through the internet, and this kind of dissolution of the ego into the void. And the reaction to it is oftentimes a sort of aggressive reaction to it. It is oftentimes a projection of the shadow, a projection and an enmity of some force within the society, or a force that is identified with controlling the entire society. So you get often these antagonisms, these separations and polarities in society nowadays, where you have this concealment of what is driving this unfolding of the technological age, and this concealment leads to the kind of radical aggression towards that externalized shadow and the projection of that shadow in some particular other group. And it is clear that one cannot escape this reconciliation with the shadow. It happens one way or the other. The question is rather whether it happens in a destructive way, whether the sense of self needs to be dissolved, or whether it needs to be reconciled. So the question is whether the reconciliation process is something that is real, or whether it's all just a contingent game of pretending. And that is the issue with the view of prophelicity as being, let's say, equal with authenticity that Möller purports. And that is the sense that second order observation is equally valid as authenticity, because the core true self is an illusion anyways. And to an extent it is true. It is important to take the kind of to take the kind of development of philosophy seriously. It is important to take it seriously that metaphysics has kind of disintegrated, and it is important to understand that it is not possible anymore to see some sort of eternal concept of the individual as something to adhere to. So in that sense, Möller is correct, and he often refers to as well as the sort of fourth big disappointment, after the disappointment of humans not being in the center of the universe anymore, humans not being some sort of remarkable creature but descendant from apes, and humans not being in full control of themselves, as Freud pointed out. There's the fourth kind of disappointment of systems theory, that even our concepts, that even our understanding of the individual as some sort of rational entity is not tenable anymore, and we are even driven by some sort of by general systemic cybernetic forces. And this is true to some extent. However, this needs to be embraced and integrated. So this void, this sort of nihilism, technical nihilism I would call it, it went under different names in the tradition of Hegel. Theodor Adorno referred to it as negative dialectics, but you can call it what you want. The kind of nihilism of it should be seen as the void, as a technical void that one needs to incorporate in order to individuate. One needs to incorporate to kind of reach the peak of sincerity, which Möller refers to as well as a traditional mode of identity, in which one tries to sincerely represent that which one was born into, and that needs to integrate authenticity and culminate in it. So a stable mode of sincerity needs to be set at the foundation. So once one is sincere at one's community and family, then one is able to create the basis for the ultimate, let's say, goal of sincerity, and that is that of authenticity. That is to be sincere with oneself. That is the kind of sense of authentic being oneself. And prophelicity is not something to be fought, but as Möller points out correctly, but it is something that needs to be reconciled. So it is something that needs to be embraced in the sense of it is an inevitable trajectory towards the philosophical abyss of technology, yet it needs to be kind of integrated in order for the new man that will come past the last man of technology, the new man, to be a more integrated whole. So the conclusion one can take from this, and here we have the first kind of display of the kind of map of the unconscious that Jung pointed out. The goal is to use that map, not necessarily in this form, but to use it as a sort of guideline for the quest. So identity is not necessarily seen as some abstract entity. Identity needs to be seen as a quest. It needs to be seen as a journey, an adventure, let's say. So what you have is the self being the center, or perhaps the totality. It can be seen as the center point, or it can be seen as the entire circle. The main thing is that it is impossible to conceptualize, as it is either in the infinitely small or in the infinitely large, but it is in the eternally unconceptualizable, one could say. And in there, the ego emerges as a sphere within the self which casts its shadow, the negation of the ego in a sense. And what you have at the top of the ego is the persona, which is the face we give towards the outer world. And the persona is kind of that which seems to be now taken hold of the ego in the form of prophelicity. So taking hold of the ego in form of prophelicity leads to the kind of radical separation, the radical polarization between the ego and the shadow. So within the shadow lies the kind of old essences of the past, all the archaic, old, let's say, substances that have been buried through the radical disintegration and deconstruction of modern technology. And this has been described as well in works such as the Dialectics of Enlightenment by Adorno as this kind of contradiction of enlightenment, where the kind of rising of the ego towards some sort of imagined age of reason leads to the shadow also building itself up, and the shadow then radically expressing itself through a radical and more extreme emergence of the most extreme barbarism, as we've seen in the last century. And at the horizon, one can see, at the plane level, there is the threshold that separates the conscious of the unconscious, the outer and the inner world. So you have kind of the world being something that discloses itself by rising from below to above. And the same way, the ego is something that has risen from below the surface to above the surface. So I hope this has explained some concepts further, and you can kind of work with this idea of dialectics. And next episode, we will focus a bit more on what it means to be in the world and what the connection really is to how we understand the world scientifically. I will see you then.